What I'd like to do today is present some of the summary findings of a large project I've been working on for the last 2 or 3 years. And it's about the future of Pakistan. And the project was designed to guess or make an estimate of where Pakistan will be 3 or 4 years from now. Since most of us have trouble predicting Pakistan 2 weeks from now, this is sort of a bold venture. But I really wanted to sort of get rid of or put in the background a lot of short-term variables, such as personality, even the economy, so to look at the larger macro variables. And so the project looks at those. And I used 3 different methodologies, three different approaches. The first was to have a panel, which I originally called the Delphi panel. Turns out that the Oracle of Delphi, her predictions were always wrong or misinterpreted. So I've got rid of the name Delphi panel, but I invited 12, I think, knowledgeable people, Pakistanis, Americans, and Europeans, and 1 Indian, to talk about, write very short papers about Pakistan 4 or 5 years from now. And that was one approach. And those papers will go up on the Brookings website fairly soon. The last one has been edited. We want to put them up there. And secondly, I conducted a review of other predictions of the future of Pakistan. So I looked at American, Indian, Pakistani estimates of where Pakistan is going. So my paper contains a summary of that review. And most of them take straight line projections. They look at the present and sort of project it out into the future. I did that in my book in 2004, The Idea of Pakistan. I tried to predict what Pakistan would look like. And so in a sense, this project is a continuation of what I did in 2004. It has to be seen in conjunction with it. When I'm done with this project, what I might do is turn my own paper to a postscript for the Pakistan book. In fact, I've got a copy of it. I'll donate it to PRIO if you don't have a copy. So let me go through a little PowerPoint. I detest PowerPoints because I've never seen one that worked right, except the Pentagon, and that's all they do is PowerPoints. But so I'll try and go through this as quickly as I can.
And it's like a real winner so far.
Yeah, it's sort of, well, we had trouble in Bergen, we had trouble in the foreign ministry, but we'll see if we can do it this. So I'll try and go through this. And it makes, I think, the major points of the project. I'll go through it systematically. Let's see if we got, yes, right, okay. So the goals were to review, analyze, and recommend. And I looked at 3 different approaches. That is the Delphi panel. Secondly, review of past predictions, and then my own paper. And what I've done is I boiled it down without any systematic analysis to about 17 factors. Some are short-term, some are long-term. But I decided that rather than deal with 17, which is an awkward number, I would divide them and break them down into clusters. I thought some of the factors or variables were related. So one cluster looks at demography, social class, education, and economics. Second cluster looks at Pakistan's national identity, which is a continuation of my own work on the idea of Pakistan. Third cluster looks at the coherence of the Pakistani state, which I think is very important and perhaps the most neglected variable of all. And finally, look at external factors such as other countries. So the first cluster of variables, and each cluster gets about 10 pages of analysis in my report. And in all the other papers, in one place or another, they're all touched. The first cluster looks at Pakistan's demographics, which are very, very forbidding. The country has probably 175, 180 million people. If they don't do a census, which I suspect they will not do because of the floods, nobody will know how many Pakistanis there are and how many Pakistanis there will be. But the growth rate, the birth rate is very high, and the trends are generally negative. And I try to analyze what this means for Pakistan. It means that the country will be in a more or less urban society. This may loosen some of the power of the rural elites as it becomes more urbanized, and Pakistani politics becomes more urban-oriented. Also, it means that more and more young people will be uneducated. Education has not kept up with the demand at all, even compared with India, where it's not very good. Pakistan is probably worse off. There is a Pakistani middle class that's emerging, and I think that, so I try to look at what's the implications of this emerging middle class for Pakistani politics. And Vali Nasser, who I respect and admire his scholarship, I think he's wrong on this point, he makes the argument that the middle classes in the Islamic world are a source of hope for progress. the middle classes in Arab and Muslim countries, make you optimistic about the future. That might be true, but it's not inevitably true, because middle classes everywhere have been the basis for radical movements, where a young, disillusioned middle class elite or middle class person sort of organizes and takes to the village or takes to the Ritz. And Castro was middle class. Stalin and Lenin were middle class. Hitler was middle class, for that matter. So having a middle class does not ensure a democratic future. In fact, many authoritarian states are based on the middle class, because authoritarianism can deliver things that the middle class wants. On the other hand, democracies are usually based on middle classes also, so it's a variable that cuts both ways. The economy is, I'm not an economist, I relied on Shuja Nawaz for the analysis, but Pakistan seems to have missed a lot of opportunities, economic opportunities to take advantage of globalization and so forth. And its economy is really aid dependent. There's not much that's manufactured in Pakistan that's of value elsewhere, traditional goods, but you can't sustain a country of 175 million people on selling handicrafts and carpets. So I'm pessimistic about the future of the economy. The economy also drives demography. This isn't my area, but I know that populations decline and level off as they grow, as they become more prosperous. So the best birth control mechanism is to have a prosperous middle class. And that's not happening at all. And what the floods will do for the economy is another question. So that's one cluster, and I won't attempt to sum up positive or negative, but clearly there's a lot of things to be alarmed about in this cluster. The second cluster, Pakistan's identity, and I looked at the debate over the idea of Pakistan, the Army's vision of Pakistan, the Islamist vision of Pakistan, sort of the middle-class, westernized vision of Pakistan. And after 62 years, there's still no consensus about what the purpose of Pakistan is, except to beat India in cricket. And that's one thing Pakistanis can agree on, but even that's sort of losing its attraction. There are a lot of mini Pakistans when you get to the provinces, Baluchistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and even the MQM, sort of ethnic separatism from Pakistan. So the idea of Pakistan is less strong among some of these groups. And finally, you have the radical Islamist challenge to the idea of Pakistan. But here the Islamists really are very diverse and varied among themselves. And David Hansen certainly knows more about this than I do. The analogy I use is the Islamist movement compared with, say, historic communist movements, where among the communists you had Trotskyites, Marxists, Leninists, Maoists, whole variety of groups that often thought each were their major enemy. They disagreed and fought among each other. So in a sense, I would predict that if there is as Islamist movements grow in influence in Pakistan, David might want to comment on this, that they will fall on among each other. I don't think there's a guiding principle to unite them. You know, Pakistani Islamists are divided by sect, by Shia and Sunni, and also by language and by region. So, and again, I think that the radical Islamist challenge has been overblown by Westerners who are afraid of the green tide. On the other hand, it is gaining foothold in Pakistan. The most depressing thing I've read this last year was an interview with Ahmed Rashid in Der Spiegel. And Ahmed says, Ahmed Rashid says that, he's really afraid of the future of Pakistan, that the Islamists are growing in influence and power. I think that's true. In a sense, their ideas color everybody's vision of the world, but I'm sure that they will fall out among each other if that day comes. Third cluster looks at the coherence of the Pakistani state. Here I was influenced strongly by a book I read by, I've got his name now, Ilhan Ejaz, is that right? Do you remember? A professor at Qadi-Azam University. And he talks about the origins of the crumbling of the Pakistani state. And I think it's a very good study, young Pakistani historian that I do not know. And he sort of details the way in which the state apparatus in Pakistan was dismantled systematically, especially by the military of Ayub Khan. And I see Pakistan as a state that's lost its stateness, that it's lost its bureaucratic capabilities simply to do things. And I would argue that the present inept response to the flood relief and also the lack of preparation earlier in terms of environment and population growth is due directly to the absence of the Pakistani state's capabilities. Even by Indian standards, which are pretty low, the Pakistani state doesn't do much in terms of environmental protection. So I think, and that's contributed directly to the recent flood, consequences of the flood. So I think that loss of Pakistani state capabilities is a very significant factor, and one that's underestimated by most of the studies I've read about Pakistan. The leaders and the parties, I think that what has happened is that the present system has forced the political parties to work together as never before. Once I gave a talk in Lahore at a launching of my book, and a commentator was a Pakistani general who said to everybody, and I agreed with him at the time, the Pakistani politicians' first preference was that they be in power. Their second preference was that the army be in power. I think that's changing. I think that they're beginning to work together. They have to work together in coalition governments at the center in the states. That's a good sign in a list of gloomy factors. I think that's a very positive sign. Hopefully it'll be nurtured and will grow in the future. But you need Pakistani political parties to develop integrity and coherence and work with each other, at least the secular parties, towards common aims. And they did this in the 18th Amendment and so forth. So a couple of important things have happened. The army, of course, is the giant factor in Pakistan's future. I can summarize my views of the army. I don't think they've changed at all in the past 10 years, 15 years. The army can't govern Pakistan, but it won't let anybody else govern it either. And the army has to decide whether it will allow competent civilian leadership to emerge and to accept responsibility and to be judged by the people of Pakistan. Unless that happens, the army is going to keep on intervening time and time again. I don't think Kiani will do this soon, but I would suspect that you may get another military intervention, which wouldn't change the basic nature of the system. I talked about basic governance, the judiciary. There's discussions of that in my paper and some of the other papers. The media are seen as a bright factor in Pakistan, and clearly there's a new transformation of the Pakistani media with something like 70 or 80 television channels. And I can't get an accurate number. Maybe somebody can provide that. Actually, how many private TV channels there are. I've seen some of them, and I've read reports of some of them, and some of them are okay. Some of them are very irresponsible and sort of polemic and so forth. But I think that given time, that will work itself out. I have faith in Pakistani journalists and media people that sooner or later the bad ones will disappear. People will stop watching, and the good ones will at least some good ones will survive. But again, that depends on the professionalism and competence of the journalist, and we'll see how that happens. And finally, I looked at another as a factor, the way in which government transitions have taken place. Have they been steered from the outside, from the inside? Have they been peaceful? Obviously, most of them have not been peaceful. Most have been involved the army intervening. But I think recently there have been some successful transitions, and I think the transition from Musharraf to, it would have been Benazir, but to Zardari was better than in the past. And I think it's getting better in a sense. Pakistanis, I think, are learning that a peaceful, orderly transition is in their interest. I won't say much more about that, but let's go to the final group of factors. I think there's also external variables in Pakistan. Americans tend to look at Pakistan through Afghanistan eyes. And most American analysts see Pakistan solely through Afghanistan. For us, it's AFPAC. And I tell them, no, it's not AFPAC, it's PAC-AF, or it's PAC-PAC. The one American official who I think shares this view is our Vice President, Joe Biden, who from the very beginning felt that Pakistan was far more important than Afghanistan. So in the debates we've had over our Afghanistan policy, Biden has been on the side of, you know, let's help Pakistan. Afghanistan is a marginal interest. But most Americans, because we're fighting a war in Afghanistan, see Pakistan as important because of Afghanistan. I see Afghanistan as important because of Pakistan. I just have that. I've made that decision a long time ago. But clearly, what happens in Afghanistan will shape what happens in Pakistan. And I won't go into the scenarios, optimistic or pessimistic scenarios. But the worst thing I think would happen would be a civil war in Afghanistan, with the Pakistanis supporting the South and the Taliban and Pashtuns, the Indians supporting the North. Where would the Americans be? I mean, would we support our traditional Pakistani allies? Would we support the Indians? Would we pull out completely? I don't know. I don't think anybody in Washington knows. But this was a scenario projected by Bob Blackwell, the former U.S. ambassador to India, where he said, what is going to happen, it will be a de facto partition of Afghanistan, and we should be on the north side with the Indians against the Pakistanis. we can debate and argue that. I think there are better solutions than that, but I think Afghanistan is a factor in Pakistan. America is obviously a big factor. Who was it who wrote the book, Allah, America and Arms or something like that? The Army, yeah. I think it was was that Haqqani? Yeah, Haqqani's book. Hussein is the Pakistan ambassador in Washington, great ambassador, good friend of mine. The title is probably appropriate. America is still a major factor in Pakistani politics. I won't go into the details. They're grim enough. But India, I think, is a neglected factor. While I think that India could be the major player in Pakistan if it wanted to. But for the most part, Indians are divided themselves about what kind of policy they have towards Pakistan. I think there's now a growing realization in New Delhi that a failed Pakistan, a really failed Pakistan, would not be good for India. In a sense, India's worst nightmare would be its fondest wish to come true. And I think responsible Indians understand that a really failed Pakistan would mean that Pakistan would start spewing out terrorists and nuclear weapons all over the place. And the Indians have a hard enough time now with terrorism coming from Pakistan. So I think that there's serious debate going on in India as to what policy they should have towards Pakistan. But I don't see any Indian rescue mission at all. I think that there's still too much bitterness. And furthermore, any time the two countries seem to be getting close to an agreement, then you can look out for another terrorist attack. I think the Mumbai attack was calibrated to destroy and break up the India-Pakistan dialogue. So I'm not optimistic that India will or can be a major factor in Pakistan, but it should be. I think Indians have a vital interest in what happens in Pakistan. Finally, and I think China is not a significant factor. I put that in brackets. I don't think it's one of the 17 critical variables. I think the Chinese are going to be content to have a Pakistan that's stable, not Islamist, because they're worried about Islamist tendencies leaking from Pakistan into China, but they're not going to do much, certainly, to support Pakistani democracy, nor will the Saudis. Finally, nuclear weapons, I think, are an independent variable. And clearly, that's what makes Pakistan especially important for a lot of countries. And I think because of that, Pakistan's 80 to 100 nuclear weapons, everybody wants Pakistan to more or less succeed or not to fail. Even the Indians, even the hardline Indians, they don't see a failed Pakistan with 100 nuclear weapons is in their interest. Yet how do you deal with this? How do you manage this? That's another question. I personally disagree with some American policy towards this, but that's another issue. So these, I think, are another cluster of factors. I put globalization in there because I think Pakistan missed a lot of opportunities to take advantage of globalization, the positive aspects of globalization. And they've been swamped by a wave of negative aspects of globalization. Terrorists who visit Pakistan, get trained in Pakistan, get on an airplane, then come to UK or America. The Headley case, where an American was trained in Pakistan, scouted out India and maybe other countries, and had an active global terrorist career directed from Pakistan. That's globalization, the negative side of globalization. And Pakistan has gotten more of this than almost any other country I know. Okay, let me go to some scenarios. These are all vague and without numbers attached to them, but I think that in the next 3 or 4 years, that's my time frame, not beyond that, I think more of the same is likely, 50% probability, maybe 40% probability, but shading into the second scenario, which is what I call parallel Pakistans. Now, the first scenario could include a military takeover of Pakistan, but I don't think that would change things considerably at all. I think it would still be pretty much the same Pakistan. But the second scenario would be a change, I think, where everybody in Pakistan was Pakistani, but some were Pakistani/Pashtuns or Pakistani/Baluch. That is, regional separatism would increase, and their loyalty to Islamabad, whatever it is, would be further reduced. So you begin to see the coming, I won't say the coming apart of Pakistan, but the loosening of the ties of Pakistan over its own territory. Right now, they've actually lost control over big chunks of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Baluchistan, and some of the cities are no-go areas for the Pakistan government. So in a sense, I think that's the most likely future for Pakistan. Continuation of the present situation, maybe weakening of the state, but there are a few other scenarios which we look at. All are low probability, but could be high consequence. I mean, you could see democratic consolidation in Pakistan. If everything were to work out right, everything work out perfectly, Pakistan could emerge again as a more or less democratic state. But I wouldn't rate that highly, but it's possible. You could see what some people predicted, a breakup of Pakistan completely. Again, in the next few years, I don't see that happening. I think the army will be able to keep people in Pakistan by force if necessary. Finally, fifthly, you could get a degree of authoritarianism in Pakistan along the lines of a combination of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and President Zia-ul Haq. Maybe a military leader who had some charisma. I don't think the present ones have that kind of charisma, sort of a demagogic leader, which could be authoritarian, could be liberal authoritarian, could be Islamic authoritarian. I don't see that as being compatible with the Pakistani people. In a sense, it's a very heterogeneous society, and they're not going to march to the same beat. But that's a scenario to think about and look at. The sixth scenario would be a radical departure from the present. That is, the army itself, which is the center of political gravity in Pakistan, could decide to take the country in a completely different direction. There are cases where armies see themselves as revolutionary agents. Indonesia to some extent, but there are other armies around the world have taken the lead in transforming their people. Some of the Latin American armies from time to time, usually they fail. In the case of Pakistan, I'm sure they would fail, but you could see this as an attempt by some new generation of army officers. It's happening. I think it's very unlikely, but I put it up there just because I want to be as complete as possible. Finally, and this may have more likelihood than some of the others, if there were another war with India of any consequence, in a sense, that would trigger a transformation in Pakistan in directions I can't even imagine now, especially a nuclear war. I think that would be just a catastrophic transformation of the region. And I've just done a short paper which will go on the Brookings website, South Asia in 2060. You know, I thought this was foolish, predicting Pakistan 5 years from now, but 2060 is even more foolish. But I had three scenarios. The first scenario leads to the United States of South Asia, where India and Pakistan get together over cricket and mangoes. They have a united South Asia. They come together with that. That's one scenario. The second scenario is sort of a continuation of the slide of Pakistan, India pulling ahead, Pakistan declining. The third scenario is a post-war scenario. That is, 20 years from now, India and Pakistan lose control over their nuclear weapons. A nuclear exchange takes place, and everybody's back in the 13th century. So, you know, the good scenario, the three projections of three trends, and you know, I can't begin to predict it. But nuclear weapons are like, I guess, black swan events. They're not nuclear war is not predictable, but it could happen. It'd have enormous consequences. And after it happens, people will explain why it happened. They'll demonstrate why it was inevitable. I mean, post hoc explanation. John Elster yesterday, I think, described that. I agree with that view. So I think that looking ahead in the long run, a war would have major consequences for Pakistan and for India. And I think that the outcome is still unpredictable. I don't want to project that far ahead of time. Yeah, okay, 6 warning signs. This sort of grows out of my clustering of the variables. What we should be worried about in the next 3-4 years and concerned about. I think the failure of the economy is important because the economy will drive population growth and education. Without the money, Pakistan isn't going anywhere. And something like, I've heard this from Americans, and I think it may even be true, even though American officials have quoted this, something like less than 1% of Pakistanis pay tax of any sort. So unless Pakistani elites are willing to pay taxes, the economy is not going to go anywhere at all. They've got to make that kind of sacrifice, pay taxes, and generate the revenue for increased prosperity. I think the failure to rebuild state institutions would be a terrible warning sign. I've talked to a lot of Pakistani friends about this, and at the very top, during crises, there's no systematic way of making policy. There's no National Security Council. There's no military-civilian discussion. There's no mechanism by which the diplomats and the soldiers can be brought in to talk about alternative strategies. It just doesn't exist in Pakistan. It's sort of ad hoc every crisis. And there's no learning from crisis to crisis. So I think if they don't build those kinds of state institutions at the top, nothing else is going to happen. There's also I won't do all this. There's confused and weak leadership at the top. I don't want to get into personalities because I think clearly think that there's obviously weak leadership at the top. I think Zardari is doing better than people thought he would do, but whether he's doing well enough is a difficult question to answer. What I look for is the emergence of new leaders, new figures who could fill the role of national leaders, even provincial leaders. And again, I see two families, in a sense, dominating politics in Pakistan. So I think there has to be sort of a farm team of new people coming up in new leadership. Dealing with outsiders, I think Pakistanis really need to insist on conditionality. When the Americans passed the Kerry-Lugar bill, there was a hue and cry in Pakistan over conditionality, but I think conditionality is good for Pakistan. In fact, I think Pakistanis should insist on conditionality. They should be the ones setting the conditions for donors, and they should stick to those conditions themselves. Not try to get something for nothing, but try and do something for something. So I think there should be a trade-off between donors and recipient about the conditions under which aid programs are developed. And so far there hasn't been that. Finally, look for another crisis with India. I think the present Indian leadership is very sober and wise. I think they were very restrained at the time of the Mumbai crisis, but you can predict new Mumbais, new events in India, possibly coming from Pakistan, which create a new crisis. And of course, the military in India would like to go bash the Pakistanis till they realize that it might be a nuclear war, in which case they pull back very quickly. So there's that contradiction in Indian policy. And finally, appeasement of the Islamists. In a sense, they've gained a lot of ground. They've legitimized themselves after the earthquake. The flood issue itself, the post-flood activities may legitimize themselves more. So in a sense, appeasement is a problematic policy because they're growing in strength. Now, not all Islamists are the same. Some are quite different. I have no problem with the Islamic Trust and charities and so forth. But some of them are linked to terrorist groups and who have active policies both in Afghanistan and India and also elsewhere in the world. So that I think these are six or eight warning signs that you have to look out for. So in summary, I think that my prognosis for Pakistan in the future is I don't like the term optimist or pessimist. And I don't like the term hope. I used to work for George Shultz, my 2 years in government, and Shultz once told me, and others of his staff, he said, hope is not a policy. But on the other hand, without hope, you have just despair. But Pakistan looks grim. The two things that make me, I won't say optimistic, but cautiously optimistic about Pakistan is, A, there's a lot of good Pakistanis, enormous number of talented people. They've just been separated from power for a long time. And B, I think in the international community, everybody wants Pakistan to succeed. Pakistanis, officially and unofficially, have a paranoia about Israel, India, Pakistan, the United States. The countries are ganging up on Pakistan. But I think nobody sees a failed Pakistan is in their interest. Certainly not the Indians and certainly not the Americans. I think we want to see a coherent, stable Pakistan in the future. So while my analysis of all the variables leads me to pessimistic conclusions, on the other hand, I can't be too pessimistic because I think that there's still enough good Pakistanis to run a pretty good country. And everybody wants Pakistan to do well, at least not to do badly. Let me stop at that point, Christian, and respond to questions or comments.